Ce l'ha duro! 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 Capra ignorante!
Hello guys and welcome back to the 36th episode of Italian Politician of the Week. I am Ipernick and I make weekly videos on Italian history and politics in English. A lot of you often ask me which episode is my favorite in the series, and more often than not I don't know what to respond. By that I don't mean I like them all equally, because that's not true, but I don't like to play favorites. However, if I really have to name an episode I'm really fond of, I am probably going to say Gramsci's, because I'm honestly proud of having been able to provide a bigger picture of early Italian communism to an international audience. This is part 2 of that video. Today I will try to explain to you the history of the PCI from Togliatti's death in the 60s up until its fall in 1989. Just like last time, I want to focus on 4 main characters: Luigi Longo, Enrico Berlinguer, Alessandro Natta and Achille Occhetto. Berlinguer is hands down the most popular of all, but I want to start with Longo, not only because he was Togliatti's direct successor, but also because he's truly fascinating. Before we begin, I have a couple of announcements to make. Both of them are particularly ironic to mention, since they are both capitalistic in nature. I recently opened an account on Subscribestar. For just $3 a month, you can support me in making more videos and perhaps to improve their quality. However, there is way more to it than that. For season 4 of Italian Politician of the Week, I want to include a special weekly episode where my paying subscribers can choose whatever politician I will be covering then. So if you don't want to miss out on this opportunity, subscribe right now. Depending on how many we are, we can either make a private poll or discuss it on Discord. As for the second announcement, I'm launching my own merch. When choosing the designs to apply on this shirt or mug, I made sure it would be something I would buy myself. I'm not a communist myself, but I have to admit that I'm very proud of how the designs turned out, and I'm probably going to buy the Longo shirt for reasons that will soon be obvious. There is also a design for my logo and some other politicians. Stay tuned because more designs are coming soon. If you are not interested in taking part in any forms of consumerism, then you can just subscribe and like the video. That's good enough of a help for me. That being out of the way, let's begin with the video. Luigi Longo was born in 1900 in a small town in Piedmont. He moved to Turin in late 1910, where he attended the Polytechnic Institute of Turin before being enlisted at the end of the First World War. However, when he came back, he quit school and instead got deeply involved with the politics in the socialist circles. For the next few years, Longo's steps are very similar to Gramsci, Terracini and the rest of the squad. He joined the New Order newspaper and took part in the PSI and PCI schism of the early 1920s. During an anti-fascist rally that took place in Milan in 1923, he was arrested and put in jail for 1 year. Shortly after his release, he will move to France together with his wife and their newborn son in 1926. He will stay there for many years, operating as a member of the Comintern. Between 1936 and 1939, he fought in the Spanish Civil War alongside the Republican forces. He took part to the siege of Madrid and made quite a name for himself, but sadly came home as a loser. But at least he still had his freedom, well, until the Germans invaded. Under Nazi Germany, Longo was imprisoned and put in a concentration camp in France before being sent to the Italian prison island of Ventotene. There he stayed up until the arrival of the Allies in 1944, when he was freed and brought to Rome. Longo didn't lose any time and joined the Garibaldi Brigade of the Resistance, the branch that was entirely made out of communists. It is also the branch that is credited for capturing, torturing and killing the former fascist leader Benito Mussolini. The assault was led by Longo himself, but the kill is officially attributed to Walter Audisio, who was also in the brigade. But according to some partisans, such as Urbano Lazzaro, he was the actual killer, and only gave credit to Audisio because the Mussolini killer is not exactly a pleasant label to have. I mean, it is now, but not so much back then. Fast forward forward to 1964, Togliatti died during a vacation to Yalta, and the Communist Party chose Longo as their new secretary. At this point, the PCI was in some sort of limbo. Ever since the 1956 Soviet occupation of Budapest, the Socialist Party had pulled out of their informal alliance with the Communists and instead got closer to the Social Democrats and the Democratic Christians, leading to the long series of organic left cabinets led by Aldo Moro and Rumor. The PCI, despite its growing numbers, was more isolated than ever, and many started to figure out that maybe the reason why this was the case was because they decided to associate themselves to another authoritarian regime. Longo was a devout follower of Togliatti, however he shared many doubts with the more progressive members of the party. However, his first few years as leader, he basically just followed Togliatti's agenda until 1968, when the USSR invaded Prague, and the PCI was the first party of its kind to dissociate completely from the actions of the regime. This became a great opportunity for the Italian Communist Party. It probably felt like as if the PCI had moved out of the parents' house and could do whatever they wanted. It was the biggest and most well-funded communist party in Europe, and now, at least according to the public perception, it wasn't associated to the Soviet Union anymore, despite still receiving funds from them. Longo approved Brandt's Ostpolitik, changed its stances on the European Union, and hoped to lay ground to a pacific coexistence between the countries following different economic systems, and for that I'd probably put him here in the compass. Longo did in many ways lay down the foundation of Euro-communism, but the man associated the most with the ideology and credited for making it more popular than ever is the one and only Enrico Berlinguer. Berlinguer was born in Sardinia in 1922. Just like Longo, he dropped his studies in the 40s to be a party functionary. He wanted to be a philosopher, then a lawyer, but he never pulled through with his studies. The 60s is really when he started to make a name for himself by traveling around communist countries and generally making the PCI look good in the international sphere. Then in 1968 he was elected into the Italian parliament as the first member of the electoral list. 4 years later he took over the leadership as Longo retired. Under Berlinguer, the PCI officially ended most political relations with the Soviet Union and launched a series of internal reforms that in turn rebranded the Communist Party to something younger, progressive, and generally more in line with the West. It is important to mention that despite the bad blood flowing between Russia and the Italian communists, they still received funds from them. Another thing is that the radical communists also dissociated with Berlinguer's moderate stances and founded the Red Brigades, a terrorist group that intended to take over the country through acts of violence such as terrorism. In 1976, the PCI had 34% of the votes, while the DC had 38%. For that reason, Aldo Moro and Enrico Berlinguer decided to come together in an historical compromise that would have included the PCI in their first cabinet with the Democratic Christians. Andreotti's fourth cabinet of 1978 was the first one to gain the external support of the communists in parliament. This was done in preparation of an eventual fifth cabinet with communist ministers in it. However, Moro was kidnapped and killed by the Red Brigades before this could even happen. Andreotti, who was conservative, didn't go through with Moro's plans after his death, and so Berlinguer was once again on his own, although he remained very popular. This is his political compass if you were wondering. His celebrity status remained pretty high until the PSI elected Gramsci as their party secretary. With his innovative communication tactics surrounding his person, he slowly started winning over many of their former communist voters. He passed many social and economic reforms that supported the lower classes by applying a new, more progressive form of socialism that acknowledged the issue of the growing middle classes and rejected the obsolete Marxist and Gramscian doctrines. When Berlinguer called Gramsci out for being a fake socialist, he was booed at from a good portion of the crowd, but he still had a sizable following. Then, in 1984, during a passionate speech in Padua, he had a light stroke. It was nothing too serious, however Berlinguer stubbornly decided to continue while visibly in pain. He stopped only when the crowd started yelling, "That's it, Enrico, go rest." But it was too late. He will die 3 days later at only 62. His passing took many people by surprise. Not not only because it was sudden, but also because it was so tragic. Berlinguer is today some sort of a communist martyr, probably even more than Gramsci, and many throughout the political spectrum truly miss him. To succeed him would be Alessandro Natta, someone very close to Berlinguer, who ultimately continued this political agenda, although without his charm and eloquence. In fact, he contributed to its decline. People consider him extremely underwhelming, though if you ask Italian communists or left-wingers today in general, they don't think anything bad of him, probably because they don't think of him at all. Instead, they like to redirect their anger to his successor, Achille Occhetto. Occhetto was a politician and journalist who was just as high ranked as Natta at the time of his nomination, although not as popular. Once he was elected in 1988, things changed drastically. Relations with the USSR were still awful after years of Berlinguer and Natta constantly criticizing the now decaying regime, but Occhetto thought that in order to revive the PCI, a drastic step had to be taken. In November 1989, 3 days after the fall of the Berlin Wall, a meeting was called in the Naville neighborhood of Bologna that will be remembered as the turning point. At the conference, Occhetto went from 0 to 100, announcing the end of the Italian Communist Party, its dissolution, and the birth of the Italian Democratic Party of the Left, in an attempt to stay on track with the times and to innovate. The news were welcomed terribly by pretty much everyone, especially the more enthusiastic communists. I think that Occhetto, just like the President Cossiga at the time, foresaw the end of the Cold War, but he was too hasty to react, making no one happy. 1/3 of the Italian communists founded the Communist Refoundation, while the remaining 2/3, made out of mostly moderates, stuck around and associated to the Socialists and the Social Democrats. At the 1992 elections, the PDS got underwhelming results, just getting 16%, which was 10% less than last year. In the 1994 general election, though, Occhetto was the leader of the Alliance of Progressives coalition, which included pretty much all the remaining left-wing parties after the Tangentopoli mess, of which the PDS was the largest component. However, he lost to the Pole of Freedom and the Pole of Good Government coalitions led by Silvio Berlusconi, who became prime minister for the first time, putting an end to what many consider the First Republic. Berlusconi is a very popular media tycoon who decided to run for office just a few months before the elections and founded the party Forza Italia almost out of nothing. But he was still able to beat Occhetto at the polls, even though he had months, if not years, to prepare for this moment. Occhetto made it his mission to beat the neoliberalism brought in by Craxi and Berlusconi in the 80s by innovating the Italian left and to push Italy through a period of social and civil reforms, and yet he got it all wrong and tripped face first. Such a failure was unforgivable, and so he resigned, allowing the new party secretary Massimo D'Alema to take command of the Italian Democratic Party of the Left. D'Alema will turn out a lot more capable, not only in governance but in campaigning too. However, we will talk about him in part 3 of the PCI specials. Well, technically we're done with the full history of the Italian Communist Party, but its spin-offs are also very interesting, so like the video if you want me to dedicate another episode on these parties, its leaders and the people in them. I think I talked enough for today. Stay tuned for next week's episode on Craxi. I will see you next time.